Hey, this is Todd. I thought today I would spend a little bit of time talking about race as class. However, I'm not going to refer to it as race as class because I don't really love that term and the term race is fraught. What I'm going to instead call it is creature as class. Ideally, I would call it creature archetype as class. That's a little bit too wordy, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So I'm simply going to go with creature as class. Just keep in mind that when I say creature as class, I'm really saying creature archetype as class. That out of the way, I know that creature as class as a concept, as a mechanic in D&D and other role-playing games is fairly divisive. You find folks probably pretty evenly split on both sides of the fence. I'm not going to go into the arguments for or against too much. I think arguments for it in an OSR context are that they really facilitate an ease of play. Reasons against tend to revolve around a lack of diversity. There is a single dwarf, there is a single elf, there is a single halfling, while humans have this whole broad diversity of classes. The argument goes, well, isn't that unfair? Why can't there be dwarf clerics? Why can't there be elven thieves? Why can't there be halfling fighters, so on and so forth? I think that originally, race as class was really just a simplification of the somewhat convoluted concepts of race in the Three Brown Books. I don't think that ultimately when they put together the BX box set and they decided to make elves essentially a heritage, we're talking about their genetics, and a class, as in their archetype of play, that they were trying to make a statement that all elves are mixed magic user fighters. Instead, what I think they were doing was looking at how elves were in the Three Brown Books and saying, boy, that's a little bit convoluted. We're trying to get to a simpler place. We're trying to attract new players who probably don't have experience in wargaming or more complex types of gaming. Let's just make it easy. Instead of having this weird thing like they did originally where you could choose every adventure, whether you're going as a magic user or as a fighter. You had to divvy up experience between those two, and as a fighter you could do certain things, as a magic user you could do other things. We're just going to simplify it. The same goes for the other ones too, okay? Instead of saying, well, all dwarves can only be fighters, let's just make a dwarf a fighter. When you look back at it, in the hindsight of everything else we're doing now, it seems like, well, yeah, of course we want elven thieves and we want dwarven clerics. I think they always had the intention of allowing players to play those other things if they wanted to, but they're trying to give you a baseline. And given that the archetype that was most in mind at that time for things like dwarves and elves was probably Lord of the Rings, and you only see a handful of dwarves of a certain type, you only see a handful of elves basically of a certain type. But I don't think they meant that to be the be-all, end-all. The argument on creatures class really just gets bogged down in those kind of areas. We want simplicity and we don't mind a lack of diversity or that's part of our setting, and hey, we want diversity. What gets ignored on both sides is that creatures class is a very powerful tool for allowing players to play any kind of creature. So let's call it your heritage, which I think I'm actually stealing from something I read somewhere else that I appreciated, talking about a particular creature's genetic. You're supposed to be able to play anything. This is something that was established in the Three Brown Books themselves. Here you go. I'm looking at Men in Magic, page 8, other character types. I shall just read straight from the book. There is no reason that players cannot be allowed to play as virtually anything, provided they begin relatively weak and work up to the top, i.e. a player wishing to be a dragon would have to begin as, let us say, a young one, and progress upwards in the usual manner, steps being predetermined by the campaign referee. What are they saying? Players can and should be able to be anything they want. Of course, I think as Gygax and Arneson would probably say, and certainly as I say, right, it depends on your setting. But I think within a setting, that's really something that we should aspire to, and like I said, often gets forgotten. Now granted, you have, let's say, a Gonzo-style OSR game, like Troika, which I played recently and I will talk about at some point soon. Had all kinds of funny races classes. In the game I played, there was a Rhino Man and there was a Thinking Machine, probably the most outlandish of the ones that ended up being in the party. And that's great. But I find that I don't see a lot, and I apologize if I'm creating a straw man here. I know there are exceptions, and of course it's what I see, and I could miss all kinds of stuff, but I see a lot of, if the system, whatever rules people are playing, has certain classes, creatures, classes, they'll be folded in. But when they aren't, then a lot of time GMs, frankly, being hesitant, are just outright saying, no, I'm going to stick with what's in BX. Or, no, these, I'm just going to stick to the core classes. Even if their campaign settings are fairly generic and they might have thousands of different creature types, they seem not to want to embrace this great variety. On the other hand, that diversity element, there seems to be a lack of acknowledgement that, granted, maybe in the basic book there are only a certain amount of core creature types, core heritages. That doesn't mean that you can't make more. They never say explicitly that you shouldn't or you can't or you're limited. And in fact, here they say you should not be limited. Don't look at the ones that are just in the book and think that's all you can do. Open up your imaginations to be anything. We know that this wasn't something that they just wrote. We know that for one of the players in Gygax's campaign played a Balor/Balrog. So we know he practiced what he preached. The fact that you can do that with this kind of system, creatures class, is never really talked about. It's not addressed by the folks who are against it, which I feel like is sort of throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Okay, in the creature classes as presented in something like Basic Expert, yes, there is a lack of diversity amongst the demi-humans. However, that does not mean that you cannot create that diversity. Creature as class, as a concept, allows a much greater diversity than a system such as 5th edition allows. Creature as class, as a concept, allows an abundance of creature types that you can't really create by other means. And as soon as I say this, I'm sure someone will point out, hey, these are these other ways to do it, and they might be there. But in the traditional, let's say, mainstream D&D style game, you really have just two ways of doing this. Either you're going to have creature as some sort of class that can have an advancement to it, or you have to do something like 5th edition does, where every heritage has to have a net zero effect or close. What I mean by that is that at level 1, all these different creature heritages you have in your game, whether that's Dragonborn, whether it's elves, dwarves, orcs, Aarakocra, goblins, whatever, has to essentially go to a net zero. They have to basically be equal. Ideally, on paper, all these different heritages are supposed to basically net out to zero. What does that mean? If you're playing human or close to human or human equivalent creatures, that works out pretty well. I don't think a lot of people will argue that somehow elves and dwarves and halflings are gimped in that sort of system. If human is the baseline, then they'll all be kind of zigzagging right around there. When you get to races that diverge more and more from there, that's when you run into a lot of issues. That's where you run into a lot of different game masters. You see this especially with flying races and creatures, or flying creatures and things like that nature, where GMs will decide either to gimp them or just not have them in their game because they feel that it is now unbalanced. If you were going to think about it in terms of a creature as class, you could space out the characteristics of a heritage over the advancement of a player character, which means that if you think that flight for an Aarakocra shouldn't be a thing until, say, 4th level, then you could create an Aarakocra advancement and say, okay, at 4th level of Aarakocra, that's when your wings have matured enough that they can carry your weight. Whatever reasoning you want to come up with, that, hey, 4th level you can fly. Maybe at 2nd level you can jump further because you can kind of jump, flap your wings, and get sort of a pseudo flight. You can sort of give these incremental improvements or things of that nature. They don't feel like they're totally useless, but hey, you don't want to unlock flight until later on, then granted, you say, great, level 4 Aarakocra, flight. This could be the same thing with your playing super powerful races. If you want to play a dragon, you can use as inspiration the different maturity levels of dragons, and you could create that advancement for them. It doesn't have to be in the BX sense, where we've taken the class archetype and the heritage and merged them together into one. This is why I call it, by the way, creature archetype as class would be my ideal name, is because you could have a dwarven fighter That is essentially what you have in BX. Then if you wanted to make a dwarven cleric, because that is a strong archetype that's out there in the world of dwarves, or somebody wants to play it, then you could just make a different dwarven class that's dwarven cleric. This is not my invention. I want to say, I'm not sure if it's Adventure or Conquer King or a different game that already basically has done that, which under each one of the heritages, elf, dwarf, whatever, had a handful of specific archetypes for that creature. So not my invention, but it's certainly a path you can take. Or you could take the path that emerges I don't know if they did it earlier than 3rd edition, but I know it's definitely there in 3rd edition because I have this book, which is all about it, which is creating basically creature levels. What they do in this book, it's clunky, it's really crunchy, and I don't know if it's going to produce perfect or even close to perfectly balanced results, but it's certainly a great guide. I had a lot of fun getting inspiration from this. It lays out how to take different abilities, monster abilities, rank them to come up with a score. They use the score to show basically, hey, what is the equivalent character level? So for example, you could see a Minotaur, pull it out of the monster manual, we'll say that's a character equivalent to level 8. If you're in your game, you had a player and they say, hey, I want to play a Minotaur. If it was an 8th level game, you could just basically hand them the sheet, essentially the monster manual sheet of a Minotaur, and then they could start adding classes on top of it, but that's what basically they would be at level 8. They'd just be a straight up Minotaur with the monster manual stats. Of course, what happens if you're starting a game at level 1 and a character says, I want to play a Minotaur, well, what you do is you use something like this, which walks you through taking a Minotaur, breaking down their powers, and giving you essentially a template for how to map that out over advancement, so that by the time they get level 8, they will have unlocked all the Minotaur abilities that they would have in the monster manual, but if they're level 3, they've only unlocked a couple of them, or they may be a reduced efficiency, power. I think that's the power of creature as class, is that you could take any kind of creature you want and break out an advancement for it. If you want to do it in the BX sense, where you say, okay, they're Minotaurs, and I'm just going to say for default that in my setting, the Minotaurs that you're running into, or the Minotaur that the player wants to play, is a Minotaur fighter. I'm playing BX. I don't have a multi-class kind of system built in, so I say, look, you want to play a Minotaur fighter, instead of having Minotaur and fighter separately, I'm just going to make a Minotaur fighter creature as class, and you're going to go. And then if later on someone else's character dies, or I start a new game, they say, hey, I'd like to be a Minotaur cleric. I feel like that's really interesting. Maybe we saw some Minotaur society that they had Minotaur clerics. Then great, I will just create a Minotaur cleric. The advantage of doing it this way is that I can really customize it. A Minotaur cleric may look and feel and play very differently than a human cleric. If I just say, here, I'm going to give you a Minotaur template and you're just going to put a human cleric class on top of it, that'll work fine, but I may find it lacking. I don't know if Minotaur cleric's going to be like that. I really want to infuse them with something unique to that heritage, to that culture that I've been creating. By creating my own Minotaur cleric class, I can do that. And of course I can do that with dwarves, elves, halflings. There's really something more diverse about doing it that way than looking at it and saying all clerics are the same, essentially regardless of whatever their heritage is. Now I could create a cleric class, then I could create a forge priest class, then I could say, okay, you have to be a dwarf to be a forge priest, and then dwarves can't be clerics, or I could just say, here's a dwarven forge priest class, because I know that the only people who are these forge priests are dwarves, so there's no reason for me to make otherwise. If someone says, well, what if you're an elf and you were kidnapped by dwarves, or you were adopted by them. They found you crying outside their mountain fastness, and they brought you in, and you were raised by forge priests, so that even though you weren't a dwarf, you became a forge priest anyway. Then great, I will create an elven forge priest class. That's pretty much what they're saying in the 3 Brown books. Hey, a player wants to play a dragon, they should go to the GM, and the GM should be open to saying, hey, you can play a dragon. If there are no dragons in your setting, granted, don't put one in. But if dragons make sense and a player wants to play one, figure out a way to make it happen. The strength of a concept like race as class is this ability to allow almost any type of creature or creature archetype to be a playable class. I think this is often forgotten or just outright ignored by the folks who are anti-creature as class because of a perceived lack of diversity. I think it's also ignored by folks who adopt creature as class, who recall the simplicity, but oftentimes don't really stretch beyond the bounds of whichever particular set of rules or material that they are playing. If you don't already, think about really embracing the possibilities of creature as class. It can certainly allow your players to really follow their dreams as far as things that they've always wanted to play that maybe they never thought that they could. Certainly they can do things in a way that you really can't do in 5th edition because of the limitations that they have imposed on creature heritage. In the OSR, it's much more open. We should be embracing that. So embrace it. Try it out. See how it fits. See how it feels. If you're using creature as class, don't just look at it as merely a tool of simplicity. Look at it as a way for you to actualize all the diversity in your setting and make it something that the players can not only encounter on their travels, but inhabit. And if you're against creatures class, don't look at it merely as a limiting structure. Look at it as a mechanic, as a method for having an infinite number of variations on the types of things players can play. That's all I've got. I hope you found this useful. As usual, please, if you enjoy videos like this, give me the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you're on YouTube watching this to follow everything. Still on my march towards 1,000 subscribers, getting closer and closer with every day, so I appreciate each and every subscription. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon and Coffee and elsewhere for helping to make this happen. Game on. I'll talk to you later.